be hard to judge your growth as a writer, so today I've got something that just might help. Hey friends, welcome back. For a long time after I started to take my writing more seriously, I often didn't know whether the things I had written were actually any good. As a result, it was hard for me to know whether I was making any progress, and I often relied on other people, usually teachers, to tell me how my writing measured up. The more experience I gained, though, the better I got at evaluating my own writing and, of course, helping other people with theirs. But it was all kind of a meandering, organic process, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, but it is a recognition that my goal was only ever as clearly defined as get better. Anyway, I tell you all this because I was doing some light academic research recently related to the topics of creative writing theory and teaching, and I came across an interesting article called Creative Writing's 5 Stages of Development: The Mind of the Creative Writer in the Composition Classroom. While the article focuses mostly on the ways that teachers can best serve students at various levels of development, I think the author's framework for the 5 stages of development can also be really useful for writers. Not only that, but I saw echoes of my own self as I read through it. So I thought I'd share their take on what differentiates writers as they grow, and also some insights into what it means, not just for teachers of writing, but for practicing writers like you and me. In describing the growth of creative writers, the authors of this article break things down into 5 distinct categories labeled with varying degrees of catchiness. The first stage, or insertion stage, is one where they say, a young creative mind, usually that of a child, begins interacting with the idea of fictional worlds and must utilize preformed worlds and roles in order to produce something new. The label insertion, then, comes from a beginning writer's tendency to insert themselves into a story or to retell stories that they already know. For example, I remember writing my first magnum opus early in elementary school. It was a retelling of the life and times of a favorite character from my favorite book series at the time, of course, in my own words. So I had created a new text, but it was wholly bound to a world and to characters that somebody else had created. It wasn't a book report, but it was also essentially a summary of a series of books, complete with the skillful colored pencil illustrations of a 3rd grader. Moving on from there, though, we encounter the doppelganger phase, which the authors say is the product of a writer's desire to live out a fantasy life through their fictional world. At this stage, writers aren't just repeating familiar stories with a fresh coat of paint. Instead, they're drawing inspiration from what they know and creating characters that are often idealized versions of themselves. This stage, the authors explain, produces more original content than stage 1, but usually lacks in character development, realistic plot construction, and adequate conflict to engage readers. So it's an improvement to be sure, but the creative work still has its limitations. And the authors of the piece point to young writers of fan fiction, and they observe that the prevalence of Mary and Marty Sue's idealized characters who seem to overcome challenges with little to no conflict are not so much a sign that something has gone wrong, as they are a normal stage of a writer's development. That is, fan fiction populated by idealized characters may not be the best writing, but it's not the mark of a bad writer, but rather a less experienced writer who is growing towards something better. And I can see something reflected in my own early writing. Once I moved past retelling stories that I liked, I started telling some stories of my own. One in particular filled nearly 2 composition notebooks and took place in a world that was my own creation, though still heavily influenced by my favorite books at the time. And while I probably didn't see the characters as extensions of myself, it's also true that the protagonists never faced any real peril. And how could they have been? I was a kid who enjoyed reading and liked writing, but nobody had ever talked to me about character development or plot structure or anything like that. I just knew that there were good guys and bad guys, and that after a long time they fought and the good guys won. So yeah, maybe it wasn't great writing, but I didn't know any better, so how could it have been? Anyway, stage 3 has the least neutral label, and these are the self-indulgent writers. They've made progress in developing more complex and original worlds, characters, and plots, but their shortfall seems to be in their inability to see past their own forming identity as writers. That is, as the authors say, writers in stage 3 are searching for praise and admiration. They regularly comment that they only write for themselves, which results in stories that may make little sense to others or do a poor job of engaging readers, because the writer has produced the entire story based on whether or not it is interesting to themselves. not considering whether others would find the story realistic or even pleasant to read. This piece also points out that there is a lot of reference to self-indulgent writers in the literature, which suggests that this is the most common stage for writers to be at when they arrive in college writing classes. And unfortunately, I think it is a pretty apt description for how I approached writing at that stage of my life. I was writing the things that I thought was cool, and I had little to no concept of an audience or a reader. I also just wanted people to tell me that my writing was good, while I told everybody that my ambition was to become an author. When I received criticism from teachers, I took it as a sign that I just couldn't hack it. And when I received criticism from my peers, I dismissed it, thinking that they were just delusional, distracted, or dim-witted. When I gave criticism, though, and this is honestly probably what I regret the most, I was often motivated by a desire to magnify small flaws or inconsistencies in order to show that I was somehow smarter or better at writing than the person I was critiquing. With self-indulgent writers, the process of giving and receiving feedback is not oriented towards helping other people to improve. Instead, it's a game of gotcha organized around preserving and bolstering young creative egos. Fortunately, if we're to take this essay seriously, this is not a terminal character flaw, but a normal phase of creative development. Which leads us to the fourth stage, actualization, which the authors describe like this. Writers in this stage still understand the personal nature of writing, but are looking to send their work into the world, and more importantly, want to build genuine connections with their readers. In other words, writers at this stage start to recognize that writing, especially writing with the intent to publish, is not all about the writers, but should really be focused on the readers. Not only that, but Stage 4 students have come to appreciate constructive criticism, and they will regularly take notes on any feedback they can get their hands on. But the authors point out, they often just make the changes that readers suggest, but many do not yet value understanding why one sentence style works versus another. So writers in the actualization stage want to get better, and they recognize that feedback is not an attack on them, but information from a reader that will help them to improve. The drawback, though, is while they are receptive to feedback, they don't fully understand the reasoning behind the feedback. So they do things to get better, but they don't really understand why they're doing those things. And by the time I was getting into my final years of college, I think I was rounding the corner into this stage. For example, at the end of one semester, I picked up a portfolio of poems that I had submitted for a creative writing class. My professor had written on the grade sheet that my portfolio had the best sentences in the class and some of the better poems. It's funny how we remember the comments that our writing teachers leave. Could I tell you one thing that any of my science teachers ever wrote on any of my papers? No, I can't. But we remember the things our writing teachers tell us for some reason, even those of us who don't pursue writing. Anyway, I still think about that comment from time to time. I was delighted to have written some of the best sentences in the class, but I was also puzzled by how the best sentences didn't equal the best poems. There were people in the class, that comment seemed to say, that even though they weren't writing sentences as well as I was, were still writing better poems. Earlier in my development, that kind of comment probably would have dissuaded me from writing more poetry. I would have taken it as a sign that I was a bad poet. When I did read it, though, I saw it as more of a guide. It showed me that there was more to poetry than syntax, and that I had a lot more to learn. But it also showed me that I was on my way. Of course, I still didn't have a clue what to do with that comment, but I was thinking more carefully about my readers, and I wasn't writing anymore just to get praise, but instead to get better. Which leads us to the fifth and final stage, where we meet the reflective writers. These writers have developed their critical eye, and are usually willing to help others with their work by providing good feedback. Reflective writers understand their writing in a way that writers in other stages just don't. They don't think that their writing is good or that they need to change it just because somebody tells them to. Instead, they know what they're trying to accomplish, and they understand why or why not they're going to make the suggested changes. Reflective writers are able to assess their writing from a reader's perspective. They want to engage their readers in a particular way, and they know how to do that effectively. In other words, they know when writing works, they know when it doesn't, and more importantly, they understand why. And it seems pretty audacious to put oneself in the fifth tier of writing development, but first, I would be a pretty poor teacher if I weren't there, and second, we're not saying that reflective writers don't still have room to improve. just that they have a heightened ability to assess, critique, and revise their own work independently. And really, it probably wasn't until somewhere in the transition from college to poetry school that I started to approach writing in a more reflective way. That also happens to be when I started teaching, so it's hard to say whether it was the education of studying poetry or the education of being thrown headfirst into the classroom that got me there. It was most likely a combination of the two, but either way, by the time I graduated, I was much more confident in my knowledge of what made writing work. So why share all this? Well, there are a few reasons, but before we do that, it's probably worth sharing a few asterisks. Like any theoretical academic framework, this one has its limitations. It was developed to help teachers strategize their teaching, not to once and for all rank and define different writers. Also, as the authors recognize, these categories are not completely discrete either. Writers can show traits of multiple categories at the same time. This really describes larger patterns, not a specific set of steps for every writer. That said, even things with limitations have value, and I think there's still a lot of value to get here. And the first is that this framework reminds us that writing is a skill that develops with practice over time. A lot of the ways that we tend to think and talk about writing are rooted in outdated and honestly misplaced notions that writing is a thing that only geniuses do, and then only when moved upon by great flashes of inspiration from the muses, and that you either have the gift or don't. But when we work from this framework, we can look at a piece of writing that maybe isn't as successful, and instead of saying that the writer isn't good, recognize instead that they're just at a particular phase in their development. So if you're writing fan fiction populated with overly idealized characters that maybe isn't the best writing out there, it doesn't mean that you are and forever will be a bad writer. It just means that you're moving through a normal and observable pattern of development. So keep working at it and you'll get better. And if anyone tries to make fun of you or your work while you're doing your best, it's probably because they're just in the self-indulgent phase, and their comments say a lot more about their ego than your writing. It's not just about understanding where you are, though. I think the real value of this tool is that it can show you what to prioritize as you take the next steps forward. So if you are writing the kind of stuff that aligns with the doppelganger phase, that just means that you can focus on prioritizing the skills that are characteristic of the next stage of development. So stretch yourself a little. Maybe focus on pushing past the familiar and writing about some new and different things. Maybe you'll have each chapter told from the perspective of a different character, so you can practice writing through eyes that aren't so similar to your own. Or maybe you could spend some time learning specifically about character development and plot structures and trying them out the next time you start a new project. And self-indulgent writers can focus on thinking about actual readers, quieting their own egos and seeking out real feedback instead of just hollow praise. If you're in the actualization stage, then the main focus should be on developing your critical eye, and you can practice that by giving and receiving feedback and thinking reflectively about why some things work and others don't. And I could go on, but this is the point. When you only have a vague idea of where you are and where you want to end up, it can be hard to decide what steps you need to take along the way. With a framework like this one, though, you can roughly break your progress down into phases that help you to identify which skills to work on and when. That way, instead of just working towards the shadowy, far-off goal of becoming a great writer, you can focus, for example, on the specific skill of seeking and receiving feedback with humility and grace. And I share my own experience with each of these phases, not just to confirm the validity of the framework, but to show that each of these stages takes time. This isn't something you can just work through in a 15-week class. For me, each phase was years in the making, so it's reasonable for progress to be slow. It might take you longer to get to the reflective phase, or you could get there even sooner. It really just depends on the person. The main thing, though, is not to get too wrapped up in identifying with the quality of your writing as it is right now. We're all in different places on the continuum of growth, and being more to one side or the other does not mean that you are a good or bad writer in absolute terms. So don't get discouraged, and don't get too comfortable either. We're all just practicing and getting better one step and one day at a time. Well, that will bring us to the end of our time together. I hope you found this article as interesting as I did. Not only are these 5 stages helpful for assessing where we are in our progress, but they're especially useful for showing us what we can do next to continue to grow. In fact, I think I'll put a chart summarizing these phases of growth on my mostly empty and aimless website that I don't really know what to do with. Check it out if you want to. Don't if you don't. The link is in the description. And feel free to leave your thoughts, questions, and good ideas in the comments. It's always fun to see what you're thinking, so don't hesitate to share what you found useful or what you'd like to see more of. With that, I'll leave you to it. I'll plan to be here again next week, and I hope you will be too.